The world has spent millions in advancing the field of medicine. But what if I told you that by millions, I don't mean dollars, I mean people? You see, modern medicine is extraordinary. It not only helps us survive longer, but also thrive for longer. But there is a dark history behind medicine that most people don't know. And those who do know try to cover it up. It began with good intention, but led to countless bodies being ripped from their graves, and even led to outright murder. This is the true cost of modern medicine and the history of body snatching. But to truly understand how we got there, we need to go back not 20 years, not 50, not even 100 years. We need to go back 2,300 years to ancient Greece. Chapter 1: The Father of Anatomy. In the year 335 BC, Greece was undergoing significant political and economic changes. Its education system was heavily influenced by Stoicism and Platonism, philosophies that emphasized wisdom and mentorship. Medical students were no exception. They sought guidance from respected teachers, and one of the most renowned of them was Herophilus. Little is known about the early years of Herophilus' life. However, what we do know is that he spent his childhood in Greece, and then he eventually moved to the Egyptian city of Alexandria to begin his medical training under the guidance of the physician named Praxagoras of Kos. At the time, Alexandria was home to the largest library in the world. Historical records estimate that it housed around 700,000 scrolls. Because of this, the city became a hotbed for philosophers, scientists, and the world's finest medical practitioners. Here, Herophilus would go on to become a celebrated physician with an unparalleled understanding of the human body. But how did he achieve this distinction? Well, at the time, most physicians studied anatomy through vivisection, which is the dissecting of animals to learn about bodily functions. Herophilus, however, had a different approach, one that could have landed him in prison or even cost him his life. You see, the Greeks, guided by Platonic teachings, believed that the soul was imprisoned in the body after death. They held the human body sacred, and tampering with it, especially opening it after death, was considered a violation that could release the soul into the void. Despite these beliefs, Herophilus saw the limitation of studying only the outside of the human body. So to truly understand anatomy, he began dissecting human bodies in secret. Fortunately for Herophilus, Greece was under the rule of the Ptolemaic dynasty at the time, which encouraged scientific inquiry. With the support and funding of Roman patrons, Herophilus continued his groundbreaking work. But he had to remain cautious, as a shift in the political landscape would bring his research and even his life to a swift and fatal end. As time went on, Herophilus' work became instrumental in advancing the understanding of the human body. His groundbreaking discoveries not only gained the support of the elite, but also led to the normalization of body dissection in society. So much so, in fact, that Herophilus began conducting live dissections to train other physicians and even allow members of the public who were interested to observe. Through years of secret dissections, Herophilus made monumental advancements in the medical science. He proved that the brain, not the heart, was the seat of intelligence, identified specific muscles and nerves, and described the membranes surrounding the brain and spinal cord. While no records survived detailing how he obtained the bodies for his studies, historians believe they likely came from condemned prisoners and the unclaimed corpses of the poor. Due to the constant supply of bodies and the severe punishments associated with grave desecration, it is believed that Herophilus himself did not engage in body snatching. However, it is clear that his work in dissection and his fascination with the human body would lay the foundation for body snatching in the future. But that would come later, much, much later. Chapter 2: The Dark Ages. Contrary to what you might expect, Herophilus' work didn't immediately spark widespread interest in dissection. Instead, body dissection was only practiced for about 30 to 40 years. After his death, it would be nearly 1,600 years before dissection was used as a standard practice again. Although Roman Emperor Frederick II permitted dissection once every 5 years, the time and volume restrictions made it difficult for dissection to become a regular practice in the medical field. Dissection became even more challenging in 1299 when Pope Boniface VIII enacted the De Sepulturis decree, which banned the manipulation of corpses. Despite many restrictions, those most interested in anatomy and advancing medical science continued to dissect bodies in secret. For example, in 1506, when the famous inventor Leonardo da Vinci was at the peak of his career, he witnessed an old man die. Curious about the body and unwilling to let such a rare opportunity go to waste, Leonardo dissected the man to see what lay beneath the skin. By this point, he had only dissected animals, including dogs, horses, and a few birds, and even a bear, but he had never worked on a human corpse. Over the next 7 years, Leonardo went on to dissect 29 more bodies. However, in 1511, one of Leonardo's closest friends, who was equally fascinated with anatomy, died of the plague. The tragedy led Leonardo to put down his scalpel, never to dissect another human body again. Fortunately, Leonardo's drawings and sketches of the human body were kept in secret until later researchers uncovered and translated them. Through his clandestine dissections, Leonardo gained an incredible understanding of human anatomy for his time. He was able to discover and recognize that the heart, not the liver, was the core of the blood circulation system. He also described the coronary sinuses over 200 years before they were officially recognized. Whether through luck or divine intervention, it was during this time that another man was born, one that would rival even Herophilus in success. His name was Andreas van Wesel, and he was born on December 31st in 1514 in the city of Brussels. During this period, it was customary to follow in the footsteps of your father, and for Andreas that meant pursuing a career in medicine. His father was a pharmacist and his grandfather had been a physician who served the Holy Roman Emperor. With his head start in medicine, Andreas eventually went on to study at the University of Paris, which at the time was part of the humanistic intellectual movement. This movement involved translating ancient texts into modern languages, and during this time, an Italian book from 1270, Introduction to Anatomy, was translated into French. This book introduced the concept of dissection to Andreas. Eventually, the war between France and the Roman Emperor forced Andreas to flee Paris and head to Italy. There he began training at the University of Padua, an institution renowned for its long-standing tradition of using dissection as a form of medical education. Andreas pursued medicine with dedication, and in 1543 he became a professor of anatomy and surgery. With his newfound position and the academic freedom offered by Padua, Andreas was able to dissect as many bodies as he deemed necessary. This freedom allowed him to produce remarkably accurate illustrations of various organs, such as the liver, which became foundational to modern medicine. These contributions earned him the title Father of Anatomy. Not long after, Andreas left Italy for Switzerland, where he continued his work, famously constructing the first complete human skeleton from the remains of an executed criminal. From Switzerland, he traveled and worked in several other countries, including Spain and France, each experience further deepening his understanding of anatomy and solidifying his legacy. However, not everyone shared Andreas's enthusiasm for dissection. After his death in 1564, the practice fell out of favor for a time, and it would take many years before dissection became a widespread tool in medical education once again. Between the 15th and 17th century, there were several instances where dissection was allowed in specific cases, only to be banned again. However, due to the monumental discoveries and advances made when dissection was permitted, religious and political views began to relax. This shift led to the passing of the Murder Act in England in 1752, which allowed the dissection of criminals sentenced to death. This served two purposes. First, it allowed dissection to continue without enraging the public, as people were believed to care less about the bodies of convicted criminals. Second, it acted as a deterrent to crime, as many at the time believed that to reach heaven, one's body had to remain intact. Medical advancement exploded almost immediately, but there was a problem. There weren't enough bodies. In response, the government expanded the number of crimes punishable by death in the hopes of producing more bodies for dissection. In fact, the number of crimes punishable by death grew to over 200 in just a few years. But even that wasn't enough. Physicians needed more bodies, so they began offering large sums of money to anyone who could provide them with one. This led to an act that many considered even more disturbing than dissection itself: body snatching. Chapter 3: The birth of body snatching. The growing demand for bodies to dissect wasn't exclusive to England. It was a problem faced across much of Europe. As a result, many European countries passed laws that allowed for the dissection of not only criminals, but also unclaimed bodies of prisoners, hospital patients, and poor citizens. These laws provided a steady supply of bodies for physicians in Europe. However, these laws were not put in place in England. At the same time, grave robbing had become a common practice among criminals. It involved digging up recently buried bodies from cemeteries, stripping them of any valuables like gold, jewelry, and anything else that could be sold. The grave robbers would then take everything they found and sell it for money, but they would leave the body behind. However, as the demand for bodies to dissect grew and the physicians began offering substantial sums of money for bodies, grave robbers began to take the bodies as well. Over time, the public became more and more aware of what was happening and started referring to these criminals not just as grave robbers, but as body snatchers. Physicians, on the other hand, referred to them by a different name: Resurrectionists. But what drove so many men to engage in such a horrific practice? Surely the money couldn't have been that good, right? Wrong. At the time, the average person in England earned around £31.67 a year for 10 hours a day, 6 days a week of work. Meanwhile, a physician would pay £10 for a body in the winter and $7 for one in the summer. The higher price in the winter was due to the cold temperatures, which made it easier to store and preserve the bodies. That meant the average English person could earn 4 months' salary for a single body. At the time, the prevailing belief was that in order to go to heaven, your body had to remain intact. As a result, the public became increasingly concerned that their loved ones would be dug up and sold for dissection. Many wealthy individuals and families went to great lengths to protect the graves of their loved ones, hiring bodyguards to watch over them until the body had decomposed. This could take as long as a year. Wealthy families would also install metal gates and build concrete barriers around the graves to deter body snatchers. In fact, if you visit William Shakespeare's gravestone, you would find the words,
"Good friend, for Jesus' sake forbear to dig the dust enclosed here. Blessed be the man that spares these stones, and cursed be he that moves my bones."
This inscription shows that even a great man like Shakespeare was concerned about the desecration of his remains. Poorer families, of course, couldn't afford the same measures as the wealthy, so they resorted to installing makeshift booby traps around the graves to deter the body snatchers. One common trap involved attaching gunpowder explosives to a tripwire, which would detonate if anyone attempted to disturb the grave. However, this was often insufficient. As body snatching became more lucrative, the body snatchers grew more skilled and resourceful. From this point on, demand and therefore supply of bodies only continued to grow. Chapter 4: The Rise of Body Snatching. In the beginning, body snatching was carried out by the poor as a desperate and quick way to earn money. However, as the demand for bodies increased, and with it the money offered, more skilled body snatchers began to emerge. Between 1802 and 1852, there were as many as 200 body snatching groups operating in London alone. These professionals often organized themselves into small groups of 2 to 4 people. They would bribe local funeral directors to inform them of upcoming funerals. Newly buried graves were the primary targets since they were easier to dig up, and the bodies were fresher, fetching a higher price. The most skilled body snatchers, however, preferred to act before the burial even took place. To do this, they would hire young, attractive women to visit hospitals and pose as relatives of someone who had recently died. The women would claim the body, insisting on burying it themselves with their family. Once the body was handed over, it would go straight to the body snatchers and the woman would pocket a generous fee. This method was much cleaner and required far less time and effort. However, if they didn't intercept the body in time, they resorted to breaking into funeral homes and replacing the body in the coffin with weights. If all else failed, they would resort to digging up graves, a process requiring precise techniques to extract the body efficiently. First, they would begin digging directly down to where the head of the body lay, then break a hole in the coffin, tie a noose around the body's neck, and pull it out through the hole using a rope. Alternatively, body snatchers used a different technique. In this method, they would dig a hole behind the top end of the coffin until they were in line with it. Then they would dig sideways toward the top of the coffin, break it open, and pull the body through the tunnel they had made, lifting it up through the hole. Those who used this technique often would dig the hole 5 to 6 meters away, making it harder to detect that someone had dug down and stolen the body. Regardless of the method, body snatchers worked quickly, often in as little as 15 minutes. Once the body was removed, the body snatcher would strip off the clothing and jewelry, tossing it back into the coffin. This was done because the penalties for grave robbing, stealing valuables from the dead, were extremely severe. However, the punishments for body snatching were much more lenient. In fact, there were very few laws, if any, that prohibited the snatching of bodies at all. After the body was taken, it would either be sold to a physician at a nearby hospital or stuffed into a barrel, often used for whiskey or sawdust, and transported to the hospital. You might be thinking, didn't the doctors and nurses wonder where the bodies were coming from? The answer is complicated. During this time, the value placed on human life wasn't what it is today, especially when it came to poorer citizens. When body snatching first became widespread, grave robbers often targeted cemeteries in poorer neighborhoods. In America, this frequently meant African American cemeteries. During the 1780s, around 15% of the US population was black, most of whom were enslaved. Yet reports from the early 1800s indicate that over 80% of the bodies dissected at Kentucky universities were African American. In Kentucky, where the slave trade was thriving, the availability of bodies for dissection was so abundant that institutions like Medical College of South Carolina were established to capitalize on this grim supply. But dead bodies wasn't enough. This is why there are also reports of live dissections being performed on black slaves, which experts agree contributed to the complete dehumanization of the black Americans during this period. The most infamous example of this is the case of Henrietta Lacks, a woman whose cancer cells were extracted from her body without consent and used for medical research. The body snatching of black Americans became so prevalent that those who engaged in it earned a new name, night doctors. But it wasn't just body snatchers perpetrating these horrors. Slave owners would often sell the bodies of deceased slaves, and in some cases, hospitals went as far as blatantly kidnapping and killing black children to obtain more bodies. These perpetrators were known as the Black Bottle Men, a name derived from the method of killing, which involved giving the children a black bottle filled with poison. However, they also went by the name Needlemen. This dark history discussed in the book The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, where the author recounts stories from this time period. One particularly chilling quote comes from a woman recalling her childhood.
You'd be surprised how many people disappeared in East Baltimore when I was a girl. I'm telling you, I lived here in the 50s when they got Henrietta, and we weren't allowed to go anywhere near Hopkins. When it got dark and when we were young, we had to be on the steps or Hopkins might get us.
Unlike the black bottle men, who used poison concealed in a bottle, the needle men employed a different method. They would inject both adults and children with a poisoned needle, typically in the back of the arm. Shortly after being pricked, the victim would die, and their body would be sold to a nearby physician or hospital. Another quote from the immortal life of Henrietta Lacks reads,
I sure don't go out much at this time of year. You take a chance just walking on the streets. Them needlemen's is everywhere. You see, them needlemen's is medical students from the charity hospital trying to get your body to work on.
There are many more stories from this time period, each shedding light on the horrifying reality of body snatching and the murder of innocent African Americans, but that's a story for another time. So make sure to click subscribe and hit the notification bell to stay tuned for more. Jewish cemeteries were also frequent targets due to Jewish customs, which require a body to be buried within 24 hours of death. This quick burial made them an ideal source for doctors seeking fresh bodies to examine. Many doctors and nurses therefore simply turned a blind eye to the situation. After all, as long as they were getting the bodies they needed, they could satisfy their curiosity and advance their medical knowledge. The same couldn't be said for the public, however, because as body snatching became more efficient and protective measures failed, the public's fear transformed into outrage as their loved ones' bodies began to disappear. In Dublin, in 1828, a group of body snatchers was going about their business when a group of locals, mourning the loss of a loved one, confronted them to scare them off. Later that day, the body snatchers returned, but this time they brought more men with them. So what did the mourners do in retaliation? They gathered more men as well. What followed was a violent and bloody showdown, with both groups opening fire on one another. According to one of the men who was there was a volley of bullets, slugs, and swan shots from the Resurrectionists, which prompted a discharge of firearms from the defenders. It was chaos. Amid gunfire, an even more chaotic scene unfolded. Many of the combatants without guns resorted to attacking each other with pickaxes, but such is often the nature of battle. The side with more to lose tends to prevail. Through grit and determination, the group of mourners continued to fight the body snatchers, ultimately driving them off. A few years later, one body snatcher was shot in the middle of an attempted theft, and 3 others were arrested. Slowly but surely, the public began to fight back against the body snatchers. However, the tension between the public and body snatchers in Dublin were nothing compared to what would unfold in the United States, where body snatching sparked one of the biggest rivalries in American history. Chapter 5: The Resurrection Riot. It was 1788. Dissection and body snatching were common practices around the world, but nowhere were they more prominent than in New York. America was still under English rule and had similar laws in place regarding dissection. A group of young boys had heard rumors about physicians who were dissecting bodies to study what was inside them. As boys do, they hatched a plan to sneak into a hospital to see the body for themselves. But when they arrived, the physician was still there. Fortunately for them, he was already in the middle of dissecting a woman's body. The surgeon, focused on his work, eventually noticed the group of boys watching him. In what many believe was an attempt to play a prank on the kids, he pulled the dissected arm off the woman's body and waved it at them, shouting,
"This is your mother's arm. I just dug it up,"
before laughing and returning to his work. Horrified, the group of boys ran away, laughing and screaming as they recounted the event. However, one of the boys wasn't laughing. He had recently lost his mother and was filled with a deep, twisted sense of dread. What if that truly was his mother's arm? Later that day, the boy went to his father and told him what had happened. In response, the father grabbed a shovel and went straight to his wife's grave. He was confident his wife would still be there, but he wasn't going to take any chances. To his horror, however, he found exactly what he feared. The body was gone. Furious and sickened by the body snatching that had been taking place with no consequence, the man gathered a group of locals who were also fed up with what was happening. His plan was to march to the New York hospital and demand retribution. Word spread quickly, and soon a crowd of 5,000 strong had gathered behind the man, intent of seeking justice. In their pursuit of vengeance, the group brutally injured as many doctors and nurses as they could find, with 6 doctors losing their lives in the chaos. In response to the violence, the government acted swiftly to pass a state that heavily penalized anyone who took part in body snatching. Anyone caught would be fined, whipped, or put in prison. Following this, other states of America adopted similar laws to help regulate and legitimize the practice. However, while America quickly took action to address the body snatching issue, England took much longer to find a solution. This delay allowed for the rise of organized crime groups like the London Borough Gang. But even worse, the delay in addressing the body snatching issue in England allowed for what would later become known as the Westport Murders. Chapter 6: The Westport Murders. Between 1827 and 1828, body snatching reached an all-time high in Scotland. This created 2 major issues. First, there were fewer and fewer bodies available to be stolen, and second, more people were taking measures to protect their loved ones' bodies from being snatched. Some used concrete, while others relied on large metal cages known as mort safes. These factors created a supply and demand problem, causing physicians to pay even higher prices for bodies. Around this time, 2 men, Burke and Hare, were running a boarding house in Edinburgh, the capital of Scotland. One day, they discovered that one of their customers had died. Unsure of what to do with the body, one of them suggested selling it to a nearby physician, Dr. Knox. Dr. Knox happily paid them £7, and the men left, thrilled with their unexpected windfall. Little did they know, the discussion would mark the beginning of something much darker. 2 months later, another customer at the inn became gravely ill. Worried that the woman might spread rumors about getting sick in the boarding house, Burke and Hare took drastic measures to protect their business. They killed her. Realizing they needed to hide the body, they once again sold it to Dr. Knox, who paid them £7 once more. From that point on, Burke and Hare transitioned from opportunists who simply sold a body from someone who had died naturally to cold-blooded murderers who exploited their customers' trust. Over the next 10 months, they would kill 15 more people, selling each body to Dr. Knox. Rather than digging up graves, Burke and Hare resorted to murder. They targeted vulnerable individuals, often elderly or homeless, luring them into the boarding house before suffocating them to obtain fresh bodies for medical schools. These murders were cold, calculated, and committed purely to satisfy the growing demand for bodies. Eventually, the police caught wind that Hare might know something about the murders, so they offered him a plea deal. If he confessed and provided evidence against Burke, he would be granted immunity. Soon after, Hare gave detailed testimony that led to Burke's arrest. During the trial, the judge stated,
"Your body should be publicly dissected and anatomized, and I trust that, if it ever becomes customary to preserve skeletons, yours will be preserved, so that posterity may keep in remembrance of your atrocious crimes."
As a result, Burke was sentenced to death on Christmas Day, 1828, and hanged just a few weeks later. His body was then used for dissection and displayed in the Anatomical Museum of Edinburgh's Medical School. It was here that England finally decided to put an end to the body snatching problem once and for all. Shortly after the horrific crimes, the House of Commons responded to the public outcry and began investigating the body snatching issue. In 1832, 4 years after Burke was hanged, the Anatomy Act was finally enacted. This law made it clear that if a body from a workhouse, hospital, or prison went unclaimed for 48 hours after death, it was legal for a representative of the body to donate it for medical study. However, the United Kingdom wasn't the only place where such terrible crimes occurred in the pursuit of fresh bodies. Similar cases were reported in American cities like Cincinnati, Ohio, Baltimore, and even across Maryland. However, the history of body snatching is as wide as it is long. While England and America were facing shortages in bodies for their medical studies, countries like Germany faced the opposite problem. They had too many bodies. Chapter 7: The Experiments. Between 1933 and 1945, the National Socialist regime supplied its physicians with tens of thousands of bodies from Polish and Jewish prisoners of war they were executing. In fact, in 1942, a specific piece of legislation was passed allowing for the bodies of Polish and Jewish prisoners to be dissected and examined with no repercussions. However, in Germany, body snatching took a darker turn. It shifted from stealing the dead to abducting the living. During World War II, over 40 different types of experiments were conducted by doctors in the name of advancing medical knowledge. Unlike those in other countries who focused on dissecting and studying the bodies of the deceased, these German doctors performed their dissections and inspections on live patients, subjecting them to unimaginable horrors. In 1942, German military leaders sought ways to save pilots forced to eject at high altitudes. To achieve this, military officials and physicians conducted experiments on prisoners by placing them in low-pressure chambers that mimicked the altitudes of 68,000 feet or 20.7 kilometers. Doctors observed as the prisoners succumbed to the extreme conditions and died. Afterward, the doctors dissected the bodies and studied their brains to further their medical understanding. Of the 200 people subjected to these tests, 80 died during the experiments, while the remaining 120 were executed shortly afterward. This was just one of many atrocities inflicted on prisoners of war during this time. Other experiments included forcing prisoners to drink seawater, injecting them with poisons, and countless other inhumane tests. This chapter in history is arguably one of the darkest examples of body snatching. Yet, as horrific as these events were, they tragically contributed to some of the most significant medical advancements in history. Chapter 8: Heavy Price. As horrific as this period of history is, it led to some of the most significant medical advancements ever made. This has sparked intense debate among modern scholars and historians about the ethics of dissection and body snatching. On one hand, thousands, if not tens of thousands, died in the pursuit of medical progress. On the other hand, countless lives have been saved because of what was discovered. Fortunately, modern legal systems have since found solutions to address these ethical dilemmas. In the late 20th century, organizations like UAGA in the United States began promoting the idea of donating your body after death for the advancement of medical science. As a result, countries like the US now receive more than enough bodies for examination through donation programs, eliminating the need for body snatching and murder. The UK also amended the Anatomy Act in 1984, further promoting and legalizing body donation for science. Since then, various other acts and laws, like the Coroner's Act of 1988, have been introduced to further regulate the use of bodies for dissection in the name of science. The most notable is, of course, England's Human Tissue Act of 2004. As a result of these events, the Human Tissue Authority was established to regulate and oversee the use of human bodies in medical science. This act reinforced the importance of personal consent, making it clearer than ever that explicit permission must be given before any dissection or examination can take place. In fact, this act and others that preceded it laid the foundation for modern practices in many Western countries, such as asking individuals if they wish to be identified as organ donors on their driver's licenses. It ensures that even after death, no one can take your organs or use your body for purposes you never agreed to. Because of these changes, human dissection has become one of the primary ways doctors and surgeons teach students around the world, allowing doctors and surgeons to undergo more extensive training before working with real bodies, further decreasing the demand for bodies. Nowadays, body snatching is a thing of the past for the public. However, for doctors, it serves as a lasting reminder of how the pursuit of good intentions can quickly spiral into acts of evil. This is one reason why doctors take the Hippocratic Oath, pledging to do no harm. The oath helps to ensure that the desire to help many never comes at the expense of harming a few. That said, the oath protects patients, but it says nothing about the doctors themselves. One famous example is an Australian doctor, Barry Marshall, who voluntarily drank a dish of bacteria to advance medical science for the greater good. To learn more about that incredible story, click the thumbnail on the screen now.